The Siege of Paris, when the Vikings nearly destroyed France. In the spring of 845, 120 longships and as many as 5,000 warriors. Their target was not an undefended monastery or a helpless coastal settlement sitting along a quiet river. Their target was Paris. At the time, Paris was one of the wealthiest and most important cities in all Western Europe. It was wealthy. It was symbolic. And it was supposedly protected by one of the most powerful Christian kingdoms on the continent. But the Vikings were no longer satisfied with raiding easy, undefended targets located along quiet coastlines. They wanted something far bigger, something audacious enough to announce their true power to the entire watching world. What followed would shock every royal court in Europe and forever change the Viking story. To understand why the attack on Paris mattered so deeply, you need to understand what came before. The Viking Age had begun decades earlier, with fast, brutal raids against undefended coastal settlements. Monasteries were the most coveted targets, packed with gold, silver, and no armed resistance whatsoever. The famous raid on Lindisfarne in 793 sent a wave of genuine terror across all Christendom. From that terrible moment forward, Norse raiders began appearing with growing frequency along coastlines throughout all of Europe. They raided the British Isles, the Frankish coast, and the rivers of what is now France. Their strategy was brutally and effectively simple. Arrive fast, strike hard, take everything, then disappear completely. No fortress, no city wall, no stationed army was ever given enough time to respond. This speed was the heart of Viking power throughout the early decades of the Viking Age. Small warbands of 30 to 100 men could devastate an entire region in just days. After each raid, the warriors returned north, leaving behind nothing but ash and traumatized survivors. Over many years, these repeated and growing successes built something far more valuable than any silver or livestock. They built a reputation that spread faster than any fleet and frightened people across Europe. The mere sight of a carved dragon prow on the horizon was enough to empty villages. Church bells soon became desperate warning signals, ringing with urgent alarm whenever Viking sails appeared offshore in the distance. But for all their devastating success, these early raids were still small in scale and ambition. The Vikings had mastered the art of raiding against the undefended and the unprepared completely. Now, a new generation of ambitious Norse leaders was looking for far greater prizes entirely. Before Paris, the largest ambitions in the Viking world were measured in the number of ships raiding any coastline. The idea that an organized Norse force might threaten an entire capital city had not yet been proven possible. That changed when a new generation of leaders began asking a question nobody had seriously asked before this. By the 840s, Viking leaders across Scandinavia were thinking beyond mere raids and quick withdrawals. The Frankish Empire, once the most powerful kingdom in Europe, was fracturing under civil war. Three rival grandsons of Charlemagne fought bitterly over his enormous legacy, slowly dividing the empire between themselves. This prolonged internal conflict left the Frankish military badly stretched, chronically distracted, and dangerously slow to respond. The Seine River, meanwhile, offered a natural highway leading deep into the heart of Francia itself. Viking longships could navigate its relatively shallow waters with speed that no defender could match. Paris sat squarely at the political and commercial center of everything that still mattered within the crumbling Frankish Kingdom. It controlled vital trade routes, collected enormous taxes, and served as a major political symbol. Its monasteries and churches literally overflowed with gold, silver, and many centuries' worth of carefully accumulated religious treasure. For any Viking leader looking for a target worthy of a legendary expedition, Paris was obvious. If the Vikings could reach Paris, they would prove something no raid on a monastery could. They would prove that no city, no matter how wealthy or well protected, was beyond their reach. The political weakness of the Frankish court made the risk of counterattack seem genuinely manageable. If Europe needed proof that Vikings were more than raiders, Paris would deliver that proof perfectly. Viking scouts and traders who had traveled the Seine knew the river's depth, its current, and its bends intimately. Intelligence gathered over years of smaller raids gave Norse leaders a detailed understanding of Frankish vulnerabilities entirely. They did not choose Paris impulsively or by chance. They chose it because they had studied it carefully. Word spread quickly through Norse communities that a major expedition against Francia was being organized. Seasoned warriors from across all of Denmark, Norway, and beyond began steadily arriving at designated coastal gathering points. These assembled men were certainly not inexperienced novices, simply answering a romantic call for adventure with no real battle experience. Many were seasoned raiders who had attacked the Frankish coast before and survived to return home. Shipwrights worked through the long winter nights, repairing existing longships and building entirely new ones. Skilled blacksmiths hammered out axes, sharpened spearheads, and finished sword blades until their arms genuinely ached from the effort. Provisions were loaded carefully: dried fish, grain, fresh water, rope, and enough ale to last weeks. Warriors checked and rechecked their gear obsessively during the final days, mending chainmail, replacing cracked shield boards, and sharpening every blade. Picture the assembled fleet stretching along the coastline as far as any eye could see. Hundreds of shields lined the gunnels of each vessel, painted in bold patterns of red and black. Rows of carved dragon heads rose from the prows of longship after longship after longship. Thousands of warriors stood ready on a shoreline that trembled under their collective restless weight. The commander chosen to lead this particular expedition was already a deeply legendary figure within Norse warrior circles. Some sources name him as Ragnar, though historians continue debating the precise details with care. What is certain is that this leader commanded enough personal respect to assemble a fleet of that scale. This was clearly no ordinary raid driven by greed and the seasonal hope of easy plunder. This was a deliberate, organized military campaign aimed at one of the greatest cities in Europe. Stories of previous, smaller raids against Frankish settlements had filtered back to Scandinavia through traders and returning warriors. Every returned raider described a land of breathtaking wealth, defended by armies that reacted far too slowly. For ambitious Norse leaders assembling the fleet, the destination felt less like a gamble and more like a certainty. The fleet entered the mouth of the Seine River in the early spring of the year 845. Imagine standing on a riverbank and watching that many longships appear around a single river bend. The sound alone would have been terrifying. Hundreds of oars dipping and rising in the water. The dark hulls moved against the current with a steady, almost mechanical, deeply unsettling rhythm. Settlements along the riverbanks responded the only way they knew how, with immediate total panic. Terrified farmers abandoned their fields immediately and fled inland with whatever few possessions they could carry on their backs. Priests seized their most precious relics and manuscripts, hiding them desperately before the fleet passed. Entire communities vanished from the riverbanks, leaving behind empty homes and still-burning hearth fires. Reports of the fleet's progress traveled ahead of the ships at the speed of a galloping horse. Each settlement sent messengers to the next, warning that the Norse had entered the river in force. The Frankish king, Charles the Bald, received the news of the fleet's advance with genuine alarm. He had faced Viking raids before, but nothing that suggested a force of anything like this scale. He attempted to block the fleet by dividing his army between both banks of the Seine River. The Vikings struck one half of the divided force suddenly, routing the Franks with shocking efficiency. The survivors were captured and hanged from trees overlooking the river in full view of both banks. It was a calculated act of psychological warfare, a message delivered to every soldier watching. The message was perfectly clear. Your king cannot protect you from what is coming upstream. The fleet continued upriver, and nothing in the Frankish Kingdom moved fast enough to stop it. The Viking fleet moved against the Seine's current with a discipline and coordination that stunned every witness. Unlike earlier, smaller raids that moved quickly and scattered, this force maintained tight formation throughout its advance. The message being sent upriver to Paris was as deliberate as the movement of every single ship. To understand how the Vikings achieved what they did, you need to understand their complete military system. The longship was not merely a transport vessel, it was a fundamental tactical weapon in itself. With a draft of less than 1 meter, it could navigate rivers that barred any heavier vessel. It could be beached directly on a riverbank, landing warriors at a full sprint within seconds. In open water, a well-crewed longship could outrun almost any vessel a European fleet possessed. Speed was not just an advantage for the Vikings, it was the foundation of everything they did. Their primary weapons were axes, spears, swords, and round shields of layered wood and leather. The Norse axe was a devastating weapon that could split a shield with a single precise blow. In massed formation, Viking warriors created the shield wall, one of the most effective infantry tactics. Warriors locked their shields together edge to edge, presenting a nearly impenetrable barrier of overlapping wood. Behind this wall, spearmen thrust through gaps while warriors watched for any opening in the enemy line. Discipline inside the shield wall was absolute, because a single break could end the battle instantly. Viking fighters trained from childhood, treating combat preparation as a basic requirement of daily life. Rowing built extraordinary endurance. Wrestling built strength. Farming built the physical durability that battle demanded. Leadership in this army was earned through demonstrated ability, not through inherited title or social rank. A chieftain who led his men to victory repeatedly attracted followers from across vast distances. Beyond individual weapons and personal battlefield tactics, this particular army possessed something equally dangerous overall: genuinely superb organizational discipline. They moved quickly, struck before defenders could organize, and disappeared before any real counterattack materialized. Viking commanders understood the value of intimidation and used it as deliberately as any weapon they carried. The hanging of Frankish prisoners along the riverbank was not an act of simple brutality or mere cruelty. It was a calculated military decision designed to break the will of every defender still holding a weapon. A Norse warrior who broke ranks or fled during a shield wall engagement faced permanent, career-ending social disgrace. That threat of communal shame was often a more powerful motivator than any external threat the enemy posed. Viking war leaders also understood that well-fed, well-rested warriors fought significantly better than exhausted or hungry ones did. Paris in the 9th century was not the sprawling city it would eventually become centuries later. The city sat primarily on an island in the middle of the Seine, now called the Ile de la Cité. Its bridges controlled access to both banks, making it easier to defend than most riverside settlements. The city contained important churches, royal buildings, and a concentration of wealth that was hard to match. When word arrived that the Viking fleet had destroyed a Frankish army and was still moving upstream, everything changed. Church bells rang with an urgency that every Parisian understood immediately, without any explanation needed. Citizens who could leave the city began doing so, joining the already swollen stream of refugees heading west. Priests carried sacred items through the streets, arguing over which relics could be moved quickly and safely. Merchants packed their most valuable goods into carts, trying to estimate how much time remained before arrival. The city's defenders watched the river downstream with growing dread, knowing the fleet was still approaching steadily. When the longships finally appeared around the river bend, the sight was exactly as terrifying as rumored. Ship after ship emerged from the morning mist, their carved prows rising above the waterline like dark birds. The fleet spread across the full width of the Seine, presenting a wall of wood and iron. One of Europe's greatest and wealthiest cities now found itself staring directly at a Viking army. Inside the city, the debates about resistance versus surrender grew more desperate with each passing hour. Some argued that Paris could hold out long enough for Frankish relief forces to arrive and engage the fleet. Others looked at the size of the fleet below and knew that no relief army was coming in time. No story of the Viking siege of Paris is truly complete without confronting the legend of Ragnar. Several surviving medieval sources connect this famous expedition directly and unmistakably to a Norse leader known as Ragnar Lothbrok. The Norse sagas describe Ragnar as the greatest Viking warrior of his generation, feared across all Europe. He is portrayed as bold, cunning, and possessed of an ambition that simply refused to accept limits. Whether the historical Ragnar Lothbrok was the leader of the 845 expedition remains genuinely uncertain today. Some historians believe he was a real chieftain, whose deeds were later gathered into a single legendary figure. Others argue that the Ragnar of the sagas is a composite, built from the stories of several real men. What the sources do agree on is that a brilliant and ruthless Norse leader directed this particular campaign. According to later saga tradition, Ragnar used a remarkable act of cunning to enter Paris itself. He reportedly feigned death or serious illness, requesting a Christian burial within the walls of the city. When brought inside, he and his warriors allegedly rose and seized the church from within its own walls. This story may well be legend, rather than reliable historical record in any strict documentary sense. But it captures something genuinely true about how contemporaries perceived the men who led this expedition. They were not simply violent raiders who had gotten lucky against an unprepared and disorganized opponent. They were tactically sophisticated, deeply psychologically perceptive, and entirely prepared to use thoroughly unconventional methods without any hesitation whatsoever. Whether or not Ragnar himself stood at the gates of Paris, his legend became inseparable from the city. The story of Ragnar and the fake burial became one of the most retold tales in all Norse tradition. It was celebrated because it embodied everything Norse culture admired: boldness, cunning, and the willingness to deceive the powerful. Even if entirely legendary, the story captured the spirit of the men who stood at Paris that spring. The military situation facing the Frankish defenders of Paris was far worse than anyone initially admitted. Charles the Bald had already lost one engagement against the fleet before it even reached the city. His remaining forces were visibly demoralized, critically undermanned, and badly positioned to ever organize any kind of meaningful counterattack. The psychological blow of watching his soldiers hang from riverside trees had not faded from memory. Viking tactics made any conventional Frankish response extremely difficult to coordinate effectively in the field. The Franks relied heavily on heavy cavalry, a force well suited to open field battles and sieges. But against a mobile enemy that struck from the river, retreated to the water, and reappeared elsewhere, cavalry was limited. Frankish infantry, meanwhile, was less disciplined and less consistently trained than the Norse warriors facing them. Every Frankish attempt to confront the Vikings directly resulted in casualties the army could not afford. Viking shield walls held against Frankish charges, while Norse warriors exploited every gap in the defense. The discipline and aggression of the Norse fighters consistently overwhelmed the reaction speed of Frankish forces. The Vikings spread beyond the city itself, raiding settlements along the riverbanks for supplies and plunder. Monasteries and churches that had survived previous raids were now stripped of every last valuable object. The message reaching every corner of the Frankish kingdom was devastating in its brutal simplicity. Even major kingdoms, with their armies and their walls and their prayers, were completely vulnerable to this force. The Franks had always relied on the assumption that terrain and fortification would eventually exhaust any attacker. Against an enemy that could simply re-embark, move along the river, and strike an entirely new location, that assumption collapsed. Every failed Frankish counterattack deepened the sense within the city that resistance was becoming genuinely pointless. The Vikings extended their raiding patterns along both banks of the Seine, while the siege of Paris continued. Surrounding territories that had escaped earlier Norse attention now found themselves stripped of every available resource and animal. By the time Charles finally moved toward negotiation, the economic damage spreading outward from Paris was already catastrophic. Charles the Bald sat in his court, facing the single most humiliating crisis of his entire reign. His armies had failed to stop the fleet on the river and failed to dislodge it from Paris. His nobles were beginning to question openly whether their king was capable of defending anything at all. His clergy were praying for divine intervention because human military intervention had so far produced nothing. He had two realistic options, neither of which came close to resembling what anyone would call victory. He could continue fighting and accept mounting casualties with no realistic prospect of forcing a Viking withdrawal. Or he could negotiate, paying the Vikings to leave and accepting the enormous political cost of that choice. Negotiation with heathens who had attacked a Christian city was not a decision made without great anguish. Every bishop in his court understood that paying tribute to the Norse was a profound theological humiliation. Every noble understood it was a military humiliation that would echo through Francia for years to come. But Charles looked at his depleted forces, his frightened population, and his devastated kingdom honestly. And he made the only decision that offered any chance of preserving what still remained of his authority. He sent envoys to the Viking leaders with an offer: 7,000 pounds of silver to leave Francia. 7,000 pounds. It was an almost unimaginable sum, representing the wealth of an entire Frankish kingdom in silver alone. For a king who could not defeat an enemy, it was the only language remaining to him now. Charles reportedly also faced a sudden outbreak of disease within the Viking camp that weakened their force temporarily. Some historians suggest this illness may have influenced the timing of negotiations more than military pressure alone. Regardless, the final agreement humiliated the Frankish crown in ways that historians still discuss 12 centuries later. The Viking leaders accepted the offer, and the fleet began its journey back down the Seine River. 7,000 pounds of silver was loaded into longships that had arrived carrying only weapons and ambition. Warriors who had crossed the North Sea expecting a fight were now rowing home laden with unimaginable wealth. The physical weight of that silver in those ships represented something far beyond its obvious monetary value. It represented the total, public, undeniable defeat of one of the most powerful kingdoms in all Europe. A Frankish king, ruling the homeland of Charlemagne himself, had paid heathens to stop attacking his city. The news spread across Europe faster than any subsequent diplomatic message could hope to travel. In Norse communities across Scandinavia, the story electrified an entire generation of young, ambitious warriors. The reward from this single expedition exceeded what most Vikings could earn through years of smaller raids. More importantly, it told every ambitious Norse leader exactly what was now possible with enough organization. The silver itself would fund further expeditions, paying for ships, supplies, and the warriors to fill them. But the greater reward was not the silver sitting in those ships at all. It never really was. The greatest reward the 845 expedition delivered was something that could not be melted down and weighed. It was confidence, absolute and unshakable, that the wealth of European civilization was genuinely within reach. Viking warriors returning from Paris became living advertisements for the rewards of organized, large-scale military ambition. They spread their stories across the Norse world, in mead halls and at markets, and on winter evenings. Within a generation, their accounts had transformed what seemed extraordinary into something that felt entirely repeatable. The 845 expedition transformed how every court in Europe assessed and responded to the Viking threat. Before Paris, Viking raids were understood as a persistent problem that strong borders might eventually contain. After Paris, every ruler understood that no city, no fortress, and no kingdom was genuinely beyond reach. Many more ambitious Viking expeditions against Francia followed steadily in the decades immediately after the resounding 845 success. Paris itself was threatened again in 885 and 886, this time facing a siege that lasted several months. The pattern set in 845, arrive with overwhelming force, demand payment, receive it, depart, was repeated. Frankish kings paid tribute again and again because the military alternative consistently produced worse results. The success of 845 inspired a broader shift in Viking strategy across the entire continent of Europe. If Paris could be held to ransom, so could other great cities along other navigable European rivers. Seville was raided in 844, just 1 year before the Paris expedition reached its triumphant conclusion. Mediterranean coastlines, once considered safe from any northern threat, now began feeling genuine Norse pressure. The reputation that emerged from Paris spread further and faster than any fleet ever physically traveled. Norse warriors became, in the political imagination of 9th century Europe, an almost unstoppable force of nature. For the Vikings, Paris entered legend, proof that their reach was limited only by their own ambition. Only one Viking expedition in the entire age proved that no European city was truly beyond their grasp. Modern historians still debate exactly how much the 845 expedition influenced the broader trajectory of Viking expansion. What is not debated is that the reputation built at Paris lasted far longer than the silver paid for peace. That reputation became, in the end, the most durable and consequential treasure the expedition ever brought home. Later, Viking leaders explicitly referenced the 845 expedition when recruiting warriors for their own subsequent large-scale campaigns. Paris had become, within the Norse world, the standard against which every other ambitious expedition would forever be measured. For generations, the Vikings had appeared without warning, struck quickly, and then vanished back into the sea. The attack on Paris changed that comfortable image of Viking raiding forever, across all of Europe. Land, power, a future. The attack showed that Viking warriors could challenge kings, threaten major cities, and reshape European politics entirely. They came seeking wealth. They left with something even more valuable. A reputation that would terrify Europe for generations to come. If this story moved you, Viking Storyforge has many more waiting across the entire brutal Viking Age. Subscribe, ring the bell, and join us for the next chapter in the history that forged the modern world. The silver paid at Paris was eventually spent, distributed, melted, or lost to the passage of centuries entirely. But the lesson Paris taught the Viking world outlasted every single coin that was carried north that year.